Jefferson's masterpiece is his University of Virginia in Charlottesville. He saw that education was the key to the life of the new republic. He believed in what he called natural aristocracy, elites of talent and virtue, not of birth and privilege, which education could create from the ranks of ordinary Americans. It was dedicated, he said, to the illimitable freedom of the human mind. It would be a pure expression of the Enlightenment without any input from religion. For Jefferson was a secular humanist through and through. How today's religious right would have disliked him, and how very little he would have thought of them. The campus, which Jefferson called his academical village, is built around a lawn open at one end, so that, in a symbolic sense, knowledge and wisdom could radiate down and out into the American landscape. It is made of pavilions, set on increasing spaces as they recede from the eye, like a Palladian stage set. Each pavilion has classrooms at ground level and professors' quarters above. Between them are the students' dorms. Each of the 10 pavilions is built in a variant on the classical styles of architecture: Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and so on. The pavilions, said Jefferson, are cubic architecture, but the climax of the project, the rotunda, begun in 1823, he called spherical. It was based on the Pantheon in Rome. Within is the library, the round cranium of the university, literally its brain. Light floods it from the round skylight above, representing the power of nature. The books radiate the power of reason. Originally, Jefferson wanted to take this metaphor further by painting the dome sky blue and having gilt planets and stars moved across it by a sky clock. Even without that, it's a pristine space, a precinct of intellectual light, clarity, and harmony. To me, this is the most beautiful room in America. Once you've seen it, you understand why Jefferson wanted to be remembered not as President of the United States, but as the author of the Declaration of Independence, the founder of religious liberty in Virginia, and the designer of this university. Even after a century of glass and steel, when we think of public buildings, we still think of columns and porticos. The very first temple-form political building in America, or indeed the modern world, was the new State House in Richmond, Virginia, designed by Jefferson in 1785. Jefferson was totally enraptured by an ancient Roman temple he visited in Niems, the Maison Carrée, or Square House. "Here I am, madame," he wrote to a friend in Paris, "gazing whole hours at the Maison Carrée like a lover at his mistress." He had a stucco model made of it and shipped it back to Richmond, and he bullied the legislature into accepting it as the basis of the new design. At the core of the State House, where the statue of the god would have gone in a real Roman temple, there is a figure of George Washington. It was commissioned in 1788 from the French sculptor Jean-Antoine Houdon, and he gave America its first really good public sculpture, a superb display of neoclassical style and intelligence. Insofar as a single figure can, this expresses an idea about democracy. It shows the statesman as citizen, not a king, not a god, but first among equals. Jefferson specified that the size should be precisely that of a man. Anything bigger would be pretentious. So we don't see Washington as victorious general. He's a new Cincinnatus, the Roman hero who was called from civilian life to lead the army and return to his farm after victory. He leans on a bundle of rods, the Roman fasces, each rod a state, their union connoting strength. His sword is sheathed. And then there's the plough, the symbol of agrarian virtue and the planting of a new political order. Houdon's final touch, a marvellous one I think, is Washington's missing button. It lets you know that he's not a stickler for protocol. Democracy in dress. In reality, the Founding Fathers were more of a secular elite than Americans commonly imagine. Jefferson and Washington were both Freemasons. This is the largest Masonic temple in America, built in Alexandria, Virginia. It's modelled, supposedly, on Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem and dedicated to George Washington, whose flame is kept alight by the keepers of the shrine. But now inflation has set in. Washington is not the size of a man. He is a bronze colossus, 4 times life size.
George Washington, of course, was the most prominent Freemason. Harry Truman was a devoted Freemason. He dedicated the statue of George Washington in 1950. Over 50% of those who signed our Constitution were Freemasons. Over 50% who signed the Declaration of Independence were also Freemasons. And we have had 14 presidents documented as being Freemasons. And their conduct in office pretty well indicates to most of us that they have had good moral training, which probably was a result of the obligations that they assumed when they became Masons.
Masonic imagery was so important in the politics of the American Enlightenment that it even found its way onto the dollar bill, the eye of universal knowledge above the pyramid with the motto, "A New Order of the Ages." In the 20th century, it would be lampooned by the American Dadaist Man Ray with his satirical sculpture made from a metronome called Object to be Destroyed. But the biggest Masonic image of all was the monument to George Washington in the city that bears his name. 555 feet high, the biggest obelisk ever made, beyond the wildest dreams of the pharaohs. The Washington Monument is so much a part of America's mental landscape by now that it's hard to imagine anyone ever objected to it. But they did, vehemently. The political fuss and bother over the designs was so great that this one wasn't actually approved until 1848, nor was it finished until 1885. And in the meantime, every imaginable faction got in on the act. Some politicians thought the simpler designs didn't pay enough respect to the great Washington, and other people thought the more elaborate designs made him out to be a Caesar or a king, but not a Democrat. At one point, it was even proposed that all the surviving veterans of the Revolutionary War of 1776 should somehow or other be brought to Washington, where they would each fling several shovelfuls of earth on this site, thereby creating a large mound over the memory of the great man, a kind of national anthill. But in the end, an army engineer came up with a perfect and abstract form with a steam elevator inside to get people to the top, the tallest stone structure in the world. Its critics compared it to a stalk of asparagus, and Mark Twain thought it looked like a factory chimney with the tip broken off. But it is also a colossus whose figure is absent, sublimated. Its impersonal beauty takes your breath away. It's the midpoint between the first heroic style of America, neoclassicism, and the last one, minimal art. The profusion of monuments in Washington make this city into a sort of theme park representing the tides of history. Each monument is partly a shrine and partly a ride. Abraham Lincoln described the aura of the American monument when he spoke of the mystic chords of memory uniting Americans with one another through their past. The Lincoln Memorial, designed 50 years after the president's death by Henry Bacon, is deservedly the most famous. Its colossal figure of Lincoln by the sculptor Daniel Chester French sits enthroned in a temple like Zeus, gazing down the main axis of the city towards the Capitol.
When you move into that great memorial and you look up and you see the statue of Abraham Lincoln, it's impressive. But let me say that when you turn and look at the words inscribed on the marble and read the words of that second inaugural, I think it is the most beautiful piece of literature written in the English language. I can hardly read it without tears because of what he was saying to the people.